eliminating it. Because in Trump's view, the federal government shouldn't have to deal with emergencies. That task should be left to the states. And as he sees it, the only role he should really play here is being the point person on whether states get anything from the federal government at all. He loves to have that power. Remember, this is what Trump said just last month, when asked whether he would let his personal views of California's Democratic governor get in the way of delivering wildfire relief.
Will your recent dust-ups with Governor Newsom impact additional wildfire relief out there? They've requested $40 billion.
The man's incompetent. Hatred is never a good thing in politics. When you don't like somebody, don't respect somebody, it's harder for that person to get money.
The idea of a president, any president, weaponizing FEMA like that, which is essentially weaponizing disaster relief that people in red states and blue states and purple states and people who aren't political at all depend on, all to punish political enemies, is obviously unbelievably alarming. It should alarm everybody, even people who voted for it. Unlike California, Texas is, of course, a red state with a Republican governor and plenty of Trump supporters. So if Trump was going to help any state, you'd think it would be a state like Texas. And he did sign a major disaster declaration within days of the flood. But what's unclear right now is how much help FEMA is capable of providing anymore, even when Trump wants to provide it. Because for months now, we have seen report after report of people inside FEMA warning that the agency hasn't been preparing for disasters the way it normally does. In fact, the agency has reportedly been losing employees at such an alarming rate rather than staffing up to prepare for disaster season, which is normally what they would be doing during this period of time. In Texas, where there are, again, at least 161 people unaccounted for, sources within FEMA told independent journalist Marissa Kabas that, quote, barely any staff members deployed. As one FEMA staffer put it, quote, we're doing a lot less than normal. And the acting FEMA administrator, David Richardson, is, quote, nowhere to be found. Now, this is important because recovery in a place like Texas is not 1 day or 4 days. It's weeks, it's months, it could be years in some places. That's why it's important. And given the relative silence from the head of FEMA, you might be wondering what his boss, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, oversees the department, is doing with her time right now. Is she stepping in? I think you know the answer. Well, yesterday, in the midst of this crisis, Kristi Noem was asking her followers on social media to vote for their favorite portrait of her to hang in the South Dakota state capitol, of course. And no, I am not in any way joking. I thought it was a joke when I first saw it, but it wasn't a joke. I mean, they could pick between what appears to be an oil painting of her in a cowboy hat on a horse, or her in a cowboy hat on a horse, or, for some variety, I suppose, her in a cowboy hat on a horse. So that's where her head is at.
My resident, that was the one that called 911, he was trying to get to the family and all the way to water all the way to his waist and debris hitting him, and he was yelling, please throw me your baby. And they couldn't, and they got swept away.
That was just one story from the devastating flood in Texas over the weekend, where severe floods have killed at least 110 people, including 30 children, and at least 161 people remain missing. There have been incredible stories of heroism from camp counselors and community members to the Coast Guard. But the road to recovery for these communities is just beginning. According to reporting today from independent journalist Marissa Kabas, the federal recovery response from FEMA has been both delayed and deficient under the leadership of DHS Secretary Kristi Noem. The current deployment of staff and resources is reportedly far less than normal, and this is before we've even reached the peak of hurricane season. However, today Noem continued to defend the Trump administration's efforts despite Trump's stated plans to eventually gut the agency altogether. Joining me now is someone who has led federal emergency response efforts, former FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell. It's so great to see you. I've been wanting to talk to you all weekend to understand what is going on and what can happen here. At this point in the recovery effort, and I mentioned at the top of the show, this is really just the beginning. I learned that from you, from working with you. These recovery efforts can be weeks, months, even years. What can and should FEMA be doing right now?
Jen, as I continue to watch these numbers rise and the number of fatalities and people missing, I mean, this is just catastrophic. And that community is going to have a long time to recover, not just from the physical damage, but from the emotional damage as well. And so the things that FEMA should be supporting right now are, one, the continued efforts to try to find all of those that are unaccounted for. FEMA has 28 urban search and rescue teams that are trained to go into this kind of debris and look for individuals that are missing. And they have equipment that helps them, but very few of them have been deployed under the federal system. Some have been sent through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which is basically mutual aid state to state, and that's great. But they should have more moving in there so they can do this as quickly as possible and give those families some closure. But they also need to start thinking about what this recovery is. That debris removal is going to be a complicated process. I would assume that the state of Texas probably has contracts in place to support that debris removal. They are a very capable state, but it's going to take time, and they may need additional assistance to do that. And so these are the types of things that FEMA would be working with the state of Texas to support them as they have needs that they can't fill. Then FEMA can either tap into other federal agencies or use their own contracts to come in and support. But with the current restrictions of like the $100,000 limit on contracts or assignments to other federal agencies or grants, it's really slowing down that process in the ability for FEMA to be proactive and get resources in place even before they're needed.
It's to go to just your last point you made, because this is sort of, there's an impact of underfunding and cutting staff. And there's been a range of reports, and we don't have them confirmed, about how many staff are actually on the ground at this point in time. What do you make? And this is not blaming a particular person, but what do you make from what you can see of how understaffed they may be or what needs are not being met? And you've touched on some of them. I just wanted to dig into it more specifically.
Yeah, Jen, I think, the first thing that they would send is an incident management assistance team that sits side by side with that state director, embeds in that state emergency management office so they can work together. And I do believe one of those teams has been deployed, but they also are going to be that team is going to be talking to them about other resources. We would typically send out what we call disaster survivor assistance teams, these individuals that can go out, walk the community door to door, go into places where people are, shelters, churches, community centers, and help people get registered for assistance or understand what their needs are, and actually even help match them up with other nonprofits and other non-governmental agencies. But that program has been stopped, as far as I know. I haven't heard anything differently. And that's such a critical resource to bring government to the people instead of making people come find the government. And then we would send additional staff out there into the community that, again, while we liaison with the state, we also want to liaison with that local emergency manager, that county emergency manager, so we can solve problems at the time that they're needed instead of delays.
Before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you about, we are far from the end of hurricane and storm season here, as you know very well. I mentioned at the top of the show, North Carolina and South Carolina, much less severe, but they're still recovering, those communities. Kristi Noem, the DHS secretary, seemed to double down on the gutting of FEMA today. And I just would love for you to lay out in the minute we have left here what that could mean for all these communities that are preparing in this moment where we could be at the height of natural disasters.
Well, I'll just start by saying that all disasters are locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. FEMA doesn't come in unless it exceeds their capability, and then they support that state and local jurisdiction. Texas is a very capable, well-resourced state. They needed assistance and asked for assistance for this event. What happens to the states and the communities that have less resources? It's just going to make it harder for them to respond and recover.
What do you think? I'm just cheating now because I now want to ask you another question. What do you think these communities wouldn't have, because they're supported by federal resources, but what does that mean they won't have when the next natural disasters hit, unfortunately, because they will in some of these communities on the coast and otherwise?
Well, just think about the urban search and rescue teams, right? There are 28 federally managed urban search and rescue teams, but these are made up of state and local first responders, and then they're funded and trained by FEMA. If FEMA goes away, what happens to that funding? What happens to that capability? And while we saw in Texas that many of these teams were requested, again, through a state mutual aid agreement, they get reimbursed for those costs through the presidential disaster declaration. And so I can see where there's going to be difficulty in adjudicating those resources or even finding ways to reimburse them. Or is it a first come, first serve kind of a situation? All of these second and third order effects that I don't think have been thoroughly thought through.
Deanne Criswell, thank you for sharing your knowledge as we're all trying to understand what's happening here and what communities really need. I really appreciate it.